She was my landlady's sister, and one coffee changed everything. I had been looking forward to a quiet morning, the kind where the sun spills lazily through the blinds, and the only sounds are the distant hum of traffic and the soft hiss of coffee brewing. My landlady, Maria, had promised to join me for coffee today, our usual ritual, where conversations wandered from trivial jokes to reflections on life's smaller moments. I liked the rhythm of it, comfortable, predictable, and gently warm. As I arranged the mugs on the wooden table, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen. Steam spiraled upward, curling like a gentle invitation, carrying the soft scent of vanilla from the pastries Maria had picked up yesterday. I sank into the chair, letting the quiet settle around me, the morning stretching slowly like honey. Then my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting perhaps a text from a friend or a mundane notification. But it was her, Maria's sister, Claire. Her voice, calm and measured, had a slightly deeper timbre than Maria's, with a quiet authority that made it hard not to pay attention. "Hey," she said, as if the words themselves were deliberate. "I was wondering, could I join you for coffee today?" I froze for a moment. There was a strange mix of emotions that rushed through me: surprise, hesitation, and an inexplicable flutter of anticipation. Claire was younger than Maria, yet carried herself with a confidence and grace that immediately made her presence feel noticeable. Even over the phone, I imagined her standing in the doorway, her posture relaxed but deliberate, a gentle smile playing at her lips. Sure," I managed to say, my voice a little too casual for what I felt inside. I set the phone down, and in that small pause, I realized that something in the atmosphere of my kitchen had shifted. The golden sunlight now seemed to linger longer on the table, highlighting the steam from the coffee, the tiny crumbs of pastries, and the quiet corners where anticipation could hide. I caught myself wondering how she would move through the room, how her laughter might sound against the hum of the city, how her presence would change the rhythm of this ordinary morning. My heart beat a little faster, not in panic, but in curiosity. I didn't know why, exactly, but the thought of sharing this space with her, even for a short coffee, made me acutely aware of every small sensation. The smooth rim of the mug against my lips, the warmth of the sunlight on my hands, the faint creak of the chair as I shifted. Everything felt more immediate, more alive. When the doorbell rang, I stood and wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, trying to steady the mixture of excitement and nervousness that had settled in my chest. A casual morning had suddenly become an opening act for something new, something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but could already feel myself drawn to. And in that quiet, ordinary kitchen, as I reached for the door handle, I had the sense that the morning was about to unfold in a way I hadn't anticipated, and that I wouldn't want it any other way. The doorbell rang, and my heart skipped a beat, not from fear, but from a quiet curiosity that I couldn't quite name. I opened the door to find Claire standing there, framed by the soft morning light. She looked effortlessly composed, like someone who knew exactly who she was and yet didn't feel the need to prove it. Her posture was poised, relaxed, and subtly commanding, and the first thing I noticed was her eyes, calm, observant, and almost teasing in the way they studied me before settling into a warm smile. She greeted me with a voice that was calm but inviting, carrying a slight laugh that seemed to echo softly in the narrow hallway. The faint scent of jasmine drifted from her, delicate and understated, mixing strangely with the lingering aroma of coffee that still hung in the kitchen. Her hair caught the sunlight, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and the way she moved had a quiet rhythm, like she belonged in that space even though she had never been there before. I stepped aside to let her in, and I realized that my kitchen suddenly felt smaller, warmer, more intimate. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath her shoes as she crossed the room, settling herself with a casual elegance. Even the simple act of placing her bag down on the counter seemed deliberate, every movement carrying a subtle awareness of space and presence. We sat down at the table, the mugs of coffee steaming between us, filling the small room with their rich aroma. I couldn't help but notice how she arranged herself, her back straight but shoulders relaxed, hands folded neatly atop the table. When she reached for the sugar, our fingers brushed briefly, a small, accidental touch that left a warmth lingering longer than it should have. I felt a tiny spark of awareness, an internal jolt that told me this wasn't going to be just another ordinary morning. We started talking, and the conversation felt easy, natural. Her voice had a calm authority, carrying experience without arrogance, humor without pretense. And yet, between the words, there were tiny pauses, glances that lingered too long, smiles that seemed meant for me alone, and an almost imperceptible leaning in during certain points of conversation. I found myself observing her more than I spoke, taking in the subtle elegance of her gestures, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her in gentle waves. At one point, her hand moved to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, and she paused just a fraction too long, her fingers brushing her cheek in a motion that felt unavoidably intimate. I caught myself leaning just a little closer, drawn by something I couldn't quite name, a gravitational pull born of warmth, presence, and unspoken understanding. Even though we had only just met in this context, there was an undeniable chemistry in the room, subtle and respectful, like the soft prelude to a song that neither of us knew the words to yet. And as the sunlight spilled across her features, highlighting the quiet confidence and gentle vulnerability in her eyes, I realized that the ordinary act of having coffee had suddenly become something charged with possibility, something that might quietly, slowly, change everything. After Claire settled in with her coffee, the initial tension softened, replaced by a gentle rhythm of conversation. At first, we spoke about trivial things, the weather, the little quirks of the neighborhood, but soon, the dialogue began to drift into deeper waters. She had a way of speaking that invited reflection without forcing it, sharing thoughts in a way that felt like a gentle nudge rather than a demand. I found myself noticing the subtle details about her, the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she laughed, the graceful way her fingers curled around the mug, and the small, unconscious gestures that betrayed a quiet curiosity about me. Even when she leaned back in her chair, there was a poised elegance to her posture, like every movement was considered yet effortless. The kitchen, once an ordinary, sunlit room, began to feel different. The light through the blinds cast warm stripes across the table, illuminating the steam rising from our mugs. The faint scent of jasmine clung to her presence, blending with the rich aroma of coffee, creating a space that felt intimate and charged, though quietly so. I realized that the room was shrinking, not physically, but emotionally. Every glance, every shared smile making the air between us feel denser, more electric. Our conversation started to wander. She mentioned her love for old books, how she liked to spend evenings with a cup of tea and a story that transported her somewhere distant. I listened, intrigued, and before I knew it, I was opening up too, talking about my own routines, my quiet passions, the little habits that shaped my days. There was a surprising ease in it, as if the walls I kept around my emotions were softening under her calm presence. I caught myself studying her face in quiet moments, noticing how her expression shifted with each story I told. There was genuine interest in her eyes, but also a trace of something more, an unspoken understanding, a subtle acknowledgement of the invisible space we were starting to share. It was in the way she tilted her head slightly, the way she paused just long enough before responding, making me feel like my words mattered more than they had to. At one point, as I reached for the sugar, our hands brushed again. This time, I didn't pull away immediately. The warmth of her skin against mine lingered in a way that made my chest tighten slightly. I felt a quiet thrill at the connection, a tension that was neither urgent nor forced, but undeniably present. Even the pauses between words held weight. A shared glance when she laughed at a small joke, the subtle shift of her body toward me as we discussed something meaningful. These small moments carried a growing intimacy that neither of us needed to verbalize. And as the morning sunlight continued to spill over the table, painting everything in a soft, golden hue, I realized that what had begun as a simple coffee had turned into something far more compelling. A quiet, emotional tether between two people, fragile but unmistakable. By the time we finished our first mugs, I felt a subtle ache, a longing for the conversation to continue, for the space between us to remain charged with this new, unspoken connection. The day had started ordinary, but the presence of her calm warmth and gentle curiosity, had already begun to rewrite everything I thought I knew about mornings, about coffee, and about the quiet possibilities that lay in unexpected encounters. The conversation had settled into a comfortable rhythm, yet beneath it, something unspoken began to stir. There were pauses, brief, almost imperceptible, where our words trailed off, and in those spaces, our eyes found each other. I started noticing the subtle ways she responded to me, the tilt of her head when she was curious, the small, almost shy smile when a joke landed just right. And I realized that in these quiet moments, something more than conversation was happening. Sunlight shifted across the room, golden and soft, highlighting the gentle curve of her jaw and the warmth in her eyes. I felt drawn to every little detail. The way her hair caught the light, the smooth line of her hands as they rested lightly on the table, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she laughed. Each small gesture seemed to carry a weight of intention, though perhaps she didn't even realize it herself. We had moved past small talk, though not abruptly. It was as if the conversation had deepened organically, brushing against topics that mattered without being forced. She spoke about the rhythms of her life, the quiet satisfaction of accomplishing small things, the lingering regrets of roads not taken. And I found myself sharing, too, the things I usually kept tucked away, fleeting fears, small triumphs, the way certain moments in the day could make me feel inexplicably alive. There were moments when our hands brushed while reaching for sugar, or when she leaned in slightly to emphasize a point, and I became acutely aware of the space between us. It was not overwhelming, but tangible, a gentle tension that made my heartbeat speed up ever so slightly. I caught myself lingering in these moments, noticing the warmth that radiated from her touch, the soft reassurance in the way she looked at me, and the quiet possibility in the air around us. Even silences became meaningful. A pause in conversation was no longer empty. It was charged with awareness. I would meet her gaze, and for a second, everything else faded. The hum of the city outside, the ticking of the clock, even the scent of coffee and pastries. It was as if the room existed solely for these stolen, delicate moments. At one point, I noticed her brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers lingering near her cheek in a motion that was unintentionally intimate. I felt a magnetic pull, an urge to lean just a little closer, though I resisted, respectfully, carefully. And yet, even in that restraint, there was a shared acknowledgement of something growing between us, a quiet curiosity, a spark that neither of us wanted to name yet. By the time we reached the bottom of our mugs, the tension had settled into something steady and subtle, like the low hum of a familiar song in the background. It was warm, it was human, and it was entirely new. I realized that what began as a simple invitation to coffee had become a delicate dance of awareness, a slow, patient exploration of closeness, of presence, and of the quiet, unspoken possibility that perhaps this ordinary morning was anything but ordinary. Even as she smiled and laughed, a gentle pull lingered in the air, leaving me aware of every touch, every glance, and every breath shared between us. I understood, in that quiet moment, that this was the stage where something meaningful could begin, subtle, slow, and entirely alive. The easy rhythm of conversation had shifted subtly, Where before our words had danced lightly around everyday topics, now they lingered on quieter, more personal thoughts. Claire's eyes softened as she spoke of small challenges she'd faced, moments of loneliness, decisions that hadn't turned out as she hoped. She didn't dwell on them. Rather, she offered them with a calm honesty, as if trusting that I would understand without judgment. I found myself leaning forward, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, the ceramic pressing soothingly against my palms. The scent of coffee was still present, but now it mingled with the faint floral aroma of her perfume in a way that made the space between us feel charged yet gentle. I listened more than I spoke, noting the subtle expressions on her face, the quiet tension in her brow, the slight downturn of her lips before she smiled again. The way her eyes seemed to search for reassurance even as she maintained her composure. When she paused, I felt a pull, an almost instinctive desire to bridge the quiet. "I understand," I said softly, and the words felt small but sincere. She looked up at me then, her gaze lingering in a way that made my chest tighten. It wasn't flirtation, not exactly. It was something warmer, deeper. Recognition. A shared understanding that these were the moments that quietly built trust. She reached across the table, her hand hovering briefly near mine, almost brushing, and I felt a surge of awareness. The warmth of her skin against mine, even in that fleeting instant, sent a subtle thrill through me. She drew back slightly, and yet there was no embarrassment, only a quiet acknowledgement that our closeness had shifted. Our conversation turned to memories, both happy and bittersweet. She spoke of small triumphs, of moments when she felt proud of herself, and of lessons learned in ways that resonated deeply. I shared my own experiences, speaking more openly than I usually did, surprised by the ease of it, by the fact that she seemed to hear me, not just the words, but the spaces in between. At one point, she rested her hand lightly on mine, just enough to anchor the moment. I felt a steadying warmth, a gentle reassurance, as if the touch itself were an unspoken promise that it was safe to be honest, safe to be present. I looked up at her, and in that quiet glance, I saw a vulnerability that matched my own, mutual, unspoken, and fragile in its beauty. Time seemed to slow. The light outside softened into a mellow afternoon glow, spilling across the table and highlighting her profile, the gentle curve of her cheek, the calm in her eyes. In the small kitchen, amid the steam of coffee and the lingering scent of pastries, there was a shared intimacy that needed no words. I realized, then, that this simple coffee meeting had transformed into something far more meaningful. It was no longer just a casual morning. It was the start of understanding, of emotional closeness, and of trust. In that delicate, tender way, the slow-burn connection between us deepened, leaving me aware of every glance, every touch, and the quiet, electric possibility of what could grow between us, something patient, respectful, and profoundly human. By late afternoon, the conversation had quieted naturally. We sipped our coffee in companionable silence, and it was in that stillness that I first became conscious of the pull between us. It wasn't overt, not a sudden spark or dramatic gesture. It was subtler, a gentle tension that hummed in the space between our bodies and lingered in every glance. Claire leaned slightly back in her chair, her fingers curling around the mug as if it were an anchor. I watched the way her eyes caught the fading sunlight streaming through the window, and I realized I was holding my breath without noticing it. She shifted, and a stray lock of hair fell across her face, brushing her cheek. The motion was simple, ordinary even, but it made my chest tighten, my awareness of her presence suddenly acute. It was in these small, almost imperceptible moments that the depth of connection became undeniable. Our conversation had slowed to pauses and soft murmurs, punctuated by shared smiles that lingered just long enough to feel like unspoken acknowledgement. Each glance carried weight. Each gesture hinted at awareness. an understanding that went beyond words and existed in the quiet recognition of each other's presence. I noticed the subtle way she adjusted her posture, tilting slightly toward me when I spoke, as if drawn by the rhythm of my voice. And I realized that I mirrored her unconsciously, leaning just a little closer, my body attuned to the same gentle pull. The room felt smaller, warmer, more intimate, as if it had contracted around this shared energy, the golden late afternoon light making every detail of her expression more vivid, more compelling. There was a pause as she reached for the sugar again, her fingers brushing mine lightly. This time, neither of us withdrew immediately. I felt the warmth radiate from her skin, the slight pressure of contact, and the electric hum of awareness that settled between us. It was not urgent, not insistent, but deliberate in its subtlety, a quiet acknowledgement of the attraction that neither of us had named but both recognized. In that shared silence, I became acutely aware of the contrast between her poised confidence and the soft vulnerability in her eyes, and it stirred something in me, an awareness of possibilities, of a closeness that could deepen if only we allowed it. And yet, there was restraint, a respect for the boundaries of social expectation and circumstance. The tension was patient, slow, and deliberate, an unspoken promise that neither wanted to rush, that both were content to savor. As the sunlight waned, casting the room in a gentle, golden hue, I realized that this coffee meeting, initially ordinary, had become charged with unspoken awareness. It was no longer just conversation or shared space. It was the quiet acknowledgement of mutual understanding, the slow recognition of desire tempered by respect, and the subtle promise of something more, should we allow it. Even as we finally rose to clear the mugs, the sensation lingered, the brush of her hand against mine, the soft warmth of her presence beside me, and the knowledge that something profound had begun. In the quiet, I understood that what we were building was delicate, patient, and alive, a slow-burning connection that neither of us wanted to define too soon, but both of us already felt. By the time our mugs were empty, the sunlight had shifted to a soft, amber glow, filling the kitchen with warmth and the quiet calm of late afternoon. Claire and I had shared more than coffee. We had shared moments of understanding, laughter, and vulnerability that felt unexpectedly profound for such a simple meeting. There was a pause in the conversation, comfortable and unforced, where neither of us felt the need to fill the silence with words. The space between us was alive with quiet acknowledgement, and I realized that something had shifted irrevocably. She smiled at me then, a slow, knowing smile that seemed to carry all the unspoken understanding of the past hours. It wasn't flirtation or playfulness exactly. It was something steadier, warmer, and more human, a recognition that we had discovered a connection that went beyond social niceties, beyond the ordinary rhythm of morning coffee. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, mixing with the last traces of coffee, creating a sensory memory I knew I wouldn't forget. When she rose to leave, she moved with the same grace that had first drawn my attention, yet there was a softness now, an ease that came from shared understanding. I reached instinctively toward her, just enough to brush her shoulder lightly. The touch was gentle, respectful, but charged with the quiet intimacy we had built. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gave a small, appreciative smile that made my chest tighten in a way that was both thrilling and tender. Our eyes met one last time before the door closed, lingering longer than a casual glance, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of what had begun. There was warmth there, a slow-burning possibility, tempered by mutual respect and awareness. I felt the quiet ache of anticipation, the pull of wanting more, tempered by the understanding that this was only the beginning, and that the beginning itself was precious. As the door clicked shut behind her, I lingered in the kitchen, letting the quiet settle around me. The warmth of the day, the fading light, and the echo of her presence wrapped around me like a gentle embrace. I realized that what had started as a simple invitation for coffee had transformed into something subtle, profound, and entirely human. A connection built on attention, care, and shared vulnerability. In the stillness, I reflected on the lessons of the morning. Sometimes intimacy isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is found in a glance that lingers too long, a hand that brushes just slightly against yours, or the quiet comfort of sharing unspoken thoughts. The slow-building tension, the delicate gestures, the careful attention, they had all led to a moment that felt full and complete without needing to rush, without needing to define itself. And though she had gone, her presence remained, soft and warm, like the last rays of sunlight filtering through the blinds. I knew, without doubt, that this coffee meeting was not the end. It was a beginning that promised patience, depth, and connection. A beginning that, in its quiet, human way, was everything I hadn't known I was waiting for. I cleaned the table slowly, savoring the lingering memory of shared warmth and quiet smiles, knowing that when Claire returned, whether for coffee or for another conversation, this slow-burning bond would still be there, waiting to grow, unhurried and entirely real.